Hello everyone, welcome to Power Specialist Bootcamp. Today is day two. We'll be taking over by Matt. He will be speaking about Pardot administration, and I would like to, give a sweet gesture about thank you for Matt coming over our meetup and giving all our expertise to everyone here. So over to you, Matt. We can see your screen.
Perfect. Okay, I'll get going. So yeah, thanks for joining today. In this session, we'll talk about Pardot administration. And if we just move along, in terms of an agenda, I'll just give a quick introduction. We'll have a look at the learning objective today, which is around preparing you for the Pardot administration section of the specialist exam. And then we'll go into looking at the exam structure and look at the topics that you'll find on the exam. And we'll try and do a bit of a mix between theory and also demos. One thing I would say is that today's session is slightly more theoretical than most, just because of the nature of administration, because of the way Pardot syncs with Salesforce. So there are going to be quite a few slides, a few in-depth theory, but hopefully I'll keep it nice and interesting for you. And then we'll have a look in Pardot itself at some of the configuration. At the end, we'll have a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please do submit them in the Zoom chat, and then we'll have a look at those at the end. A quick introduction to myself first. Just really wanted to highlight that my background is not actually technical. I'm a marketer by background who got into Salesforce and Pardot almost by accident, really. But when I did find Pardot as a marketing automation tool, I enjoyed using it so much as an end user that I wanted to be a consultant. And since then, I've been working with organizations to help them integrate Pardot and Salesforce, and also help them to improve the marketing processes with Pardot. Wanted to look at the learning objective for today. So really, this session is all around helping you being able to handle all the questions in the administration section of the Pardot Specialist Certification exam. And just wanted to really focus on this because administration as a topic within Pardot is an absolutely huge topic. So if any of you have ever seen the admin section of Pardot, you'll notice that there are a lot of configuration options in here. And I know that when you're looking at studying for your exam, it can look quite intimidating just seeing all of those options. So today's session, we're really going to focus on what is in the exam, and try to just leave aside anything that isn't in the exam, because really we could speak for 8 hours on all of the administration topics, but we want to make sure that you're prepared for the exam. So to prepare you for the exam, the first thing we want to look at is the exam guide. And I'm sure you've all seen the Pardot Specialist exam guide. There's a link in the slides which we can share with you after the session. But really wanted to just break down some of the contents specific to the administration section. So just looking at the administration topics, what we can see is that the topics are quite narrow, actually. As I mentioned, there's so many different config options for administration in Pardot, but the exam guide is telling us to focus on 3 main areas. So that's looking at how to create, edit, and map fields. We're looking at the relationship between Pardot and Salesforce, and then we're also looking at the Pardot recycle bin. If we look at the exam as a whole, there are 60 questions in total. So our 11% of the exam, which we're going to look at administration for, means that you will get around 6 or 7 questions specifically on this administration topic. So doing a bit of a deeper dive in terms of what do these mean and what do we need to look at. This is another section of the exam guide which tells us what we do need to look at and what we don't need to look at. So if we approach this exam outline from a perspective of what is related to administration, we can see here that the sections in green are related to Pardot administration. So it looks like quite a decent proportion of what's in the exam. However, the exam is only weighted 11% towards administration. But looking at it in more detail, so we can see at the bottom, a candidate for this exam is not expected to know the following: package installation, layout configuration, and Salesforce configuration of Pardot. So that's great. We don't need to focus on this from an exam perspective. And equally, configuring scoring and grading models, that's actually covered in one of the other sessions which you're going to have coming up over the next few days. So we can again leave this aside today and try to focus on the areas in green, which I've then brought out to the side, which will be the topics for what we're looking at today. So we're going to look at that relationship between Pardot and Salesforce. So set the context for why do Pardot and Salesforce need to sync and how do they sync? We'll have a look at how do we configure and set up custom fields in Pardot. And importantly, we're going to look at how do we troubleshoot some of the basic issues that you might see when Salesforce and Pardot are syncing. So these are related to sync errors, field mapping, and also supported objects. So we'll be looking at custom objects as part of this. And then finally, we'll be looking at how to use the Pardot recycle bin. So first of all, the topic is explain the relationship between Pardot and Salesforce. So just to set the context here, I wanted to explain how Pardot and Salesforce talk together in the context of a typical prospect journey. So in a typical scenario, a visitor would come to your website and they would fill in a web form. At that point that they fill in a web form, Pardot creates something called a prospect record. And as Esha explained yesterday, a Pardot prospect record is just somebody who is part of your Pardot database. What happens then next is that in Pardot, you qualify the prospect, and qualification again is something that you'll be looking at over the next few days, so we don't need to go into too much detail today. But once that prospect is qualified, and the mechanism for doing this qualification is assigning them to a salesperson or a queue. So once they are assigned, that prospect is then created in Salesforce as a lead. And then any actions going forward related to this lead, so maybe they come back to your website, maybe they engage with emails, maybe they do any other interactions with your marketing initiatives, that all then syncs back to Pardot. And those engagements in Pardot all sync back into Salesforce. So for example, any field updates, once that lead lives in Salesforce and is synced to Salesforce, then sync back to Pardot, and any engagements with your activity interactions with, let's say, forms, landing pages, emails, and any other assets that live in Pardot, then sync back into Salesforce. For example, by updating the score on the prospect. So at this point, what might happen is the sales cycle flows normally, and then at a stage where they are sales qualified, they're likely to be converted in Salesforce. So they'll be converted to a contact, to an account, and an opportunity. And when that opportunity is won, and of course, when the opportunity is created, that information about the opportunity then syncs back into Pardot. And it's associated to that initial prospect record that was created. And we then get something called closed loop reporting. So because Pardot and Salesforce are talking together, the information about the closed won opportunity is then synced back into Pardot. And we can actually see this loop stage reporting in terms of this is the amount of prospects we've generated from a particular activity. This is the number who have then gone on to become leads in Salesforce. This is how many have been converted into contact, account, and opportunity. And then we also can see how many of those opportunities have been won, and also associate the revenue back from that one opportunity to the initial marketing initiative. So it's very important that Pardot and Salesforce are talking to try and make sure that you're getting that full circle loop of reporting in Pardot and Salesforce. So just wanted to introduce how that would be set up. And what you'll recall back from what I said earlier is that we don't actually need to cover in the exam how to create the initial link between Pardot and Salesforce. So I've outlined the install steps here, and I've just marked here, for example, that it is required to install a managed app exchange package in Salesforce before we can sync Pardot and Salesforce, but that's not required for the exam, so we're not going to cover it today. It's also required to set up a connector, and we establish what's called a connector user, which is a connector user is how Pardot actually views information in Salesforce and also updates records in Salesforce. So Pardot is actually accessing Salesforce just like a regular user of your Salesforce instance. So that's known as a connector user. We'll talk about that in a second. And also we would adjust the settings in Pardot for how the two systems sync. So the good news is that in terms of the exam, we don't actually have to do all this, but what we do have to do is understand some basic troubleshooting steps for solving problems with that integration. So we're going to talk about some of those troubleshooting steps. And finally, we need to also customize this experience in both Pardot and Salesforce. So this kind of customization might take the form of adding Pardot's information into Salesforce page layouts. And again, as we can see below from the exam guide, we're not actually required to demonstrate our capabilities of this in the exam. So again, it really does help us narrow down what you need to be studying. So some of these items, of course, they are really important for that Pardot and Salesforce integration, but they are better aligned to the Pardot consultant exam rather than the Pardot specialist exam. So really, if we look at this journey towards Pardot certifications, this specialist exam is the first entry point into Pardot. And then after you pass this exam, you can look at some of the more technical integration side like you see here. So definitely don't spend lots of time really going into details about how to install the package, how to customize page layouts. To bring in Pardot information into Salesforce at this stage. This is the kind of information that you'll be looking at for the next exam if you choose to take it, which is that Pardot consultant exam. Just continuing along, I also wanted to just point out that some of the things that we'll look at today actually might look a bit different in your Pardot org and your Salesforce org if you do have access to Pardot. So I just wanted to point out that it's a bit of a fragmented landscape in terms of how Pardot and Salesforce connect together across the Pardot user base. So there have been three main big developments over the last few years, which have changed how Pardot and Salesforce work together. These are the transition generally from using the Pardot Classic interface towards using the Pardot Lightning app. So that came out in 2018. From using the Pardot Connector version 1 to the Pardot Connector version 2, which was last year. And also the change from a concept of one prospect in Pardot per email address towards something called AMPSI in 2016. So this stands for Allow Multiple Prospects with the Same Email Address. Now, the things that we're going to look at today, and generally the focus of the exam, is more heavily aligned towards the recently released features. So anything that you're looking at today, including the demos that I'll do, including the slides, are very much aligned to the newer ways of working in Pardot. And definitely that is the direction that the exam questions are leaning towards now as well. So just really a statement just to say that yes, some of the stuff we'll be doing might look different in your org if you have access to Pardot, but definitely this is the direction that things are going in, and this is what we should focus on for the exam. Just looking back to that first scenario that I mentioned around the prospect journey from a typical perspective in Pardot, definitely one thing that you will be required to know for the exam is this kind of troubleshooting workflow. So I mentioned a journey where somebody visits the website, they submit a form, they become a prospect in Pardot, they then get converted into a contact account and opportunity. The opportunity closes one, and then we can associate that revenue back to the initial touch point. However, the prospect journey isn't always so simple, and that scenario only covers an instance where somebody first finds us for the first time and then submits a Pardot form. But in reality, there's a lot of different scenarios where Pardot and Salesforce would be syncing together. So this is a flow chart to help you understand some of the different considerations for how Pardot and Salesforce sync together based on different conditions in your Pardot org and based on different life cycle stages for that prospect. So when Pardot and Salesforce try to sync, what happens is if we've got a new record, if we've got a record that we want to sync from Pardot to Salesforce, here's the logic flow that happens. So first of all, Pardot checks for a given record that we want to sync, is there already in Salesforce a lead or contact with the same CRM ID? So if there is a record with the same CRM ID, Pardot will sync any updates to that same lead or contact that it knows the CRM ID for. If there is not a prospect, if there is not a lead or a contact with the same CRM ID, then we go down to the next step. And Pardot then checks, is there a contact with the same email address? So if there is a contact with the same email address that we're trying to update, then Pardot's going to sync that prospect record to the contact that has that email address. If no, and then we next check, is there a lead with the same email address? If yes, there is a lead with that email address, let's imagine somebody had submitted a form, for example, then Pardot syncs to that lead that has the email address that's the same that we've just collected in Pardot. And then finally, is the prospect assigned to a user? So if the prospect is assigned to a user, Pardot will create a new lead. But if the prospect is not assigned to a user, then Pardot's going to keep the record into Pardot until it is assigned. And this last point is a very important consideration. So what this says is that if we have a new record that's created in Pardot, then it stays only in Pardot until the record is actually assigned to a salesperson, or well, any user technically, or any queue. So if no, they're just going to stay in Pardot. It's that assignment to a user that causes the new lead to be created in Salesforce. And then just looking in more detail about this sync between Pardot and Salesforce, I wanted to look in more detail about what objects sync between the two systems. So we've got a few different slides on this. But just to start with, the main objects in Salesforce that sync between the two systems are leads, contacts, and also person accounts if you have that enabled in your Salesforce org. And we can see that we've got 3 different arrows here. And this represents the 3 different types of sync that we can have between Pardot and Salesforce. So for every field in each of these objects, on a field by field basis, we can set up which system is the master database for that field. So let's say, for example, the job title field. What we can do is we can say that Salesforce is always the master database for this field. So if an update to that job title happens in Pardot, that would not then be reflected back in Salesforce, and the value that's still in Salesforce would then overwrite the value in Pardot. On the other hand, what we can say is that Pardot can be the master system. So let's say this job title field, if somebody fills in a Pardot form and updates their job title, that will go into Salesforce as an overwrite to the existing field value. However, if a salesperson in Salesforce updates that job title field, then it would not flow back into Pardot. Pardot's value would essentially win, and the value that was previously in Pardot would overwrite the new value that's in Salesforce. And then finally, this double direction arrow is known as bidirectional sync. And we'll have a look at this in a second in the system. But what this allows us to do, this is the 3rd and final option for field behavior. What we can do with bidirectional sync is say that if a field value is updated in either system, then the most recently updated system for that field, whether it is Salesforce or Pardot, will actually overwrite the other system. And this bidirectional sync is, for a wide range of fields, a very logical option in that sync behavior. So this is certainly something that can definitely come up in the Pardot specialist exam. So maybe an exam question such as a field was updated in one of the two systems, but it did not overwrite the other, or it got overwritten by the value from the other system, then in your exam, you'll be then looking to think about this sync behavior. So definitely checking the setup of the sync is a really important thing to do if you're having issues with the way values are being written between Pardot and Salesforce. However, leads, contacts, and person accounts are not the only objects that sync between the two. So in addition to these, which I'm calling bidirectional sync, also there is a Salesforce to Pardot sync for accounts, opportunities, and custom objects. And by a Salesforce to Pardot sync, what I mean is that Pardot can't write to any of these objects, but they do sync into the Pardot database to be used specifically for segmentation purposes. So for segmentation purposes, what I mean is that, let's take accounts, for example. Pardot can actually read account records and then use them to build lists of prospects to target with emails. So let's say we wanted to target any customers who have an account status of churned, for example. We could actually build that list directly in Pardot using information about the account object that has flowed in using the sync from Salesforce. So we don't need to build the list in Salesforce and export it and import it into Pardot when we want to target maybe churned accounts or accounts that have renewal dates coming up very soon. We can just build the lists directly in Pardot using that information that's synced across. Equally, with opportunities, Pardot can also read those opportunity records in Salesforce, and it can sync them both for segmentation purposes, just like we talked about, and also for this closed loop ROI reporting. So to really understand the value of opportunities that have been won in Salesforce, which were initiated, or the source of those opportunities were from Pardot's launched campaigns. So the special thing to note here about opportunities is that they are automatically synced from Salesforce when a contact in Salesforce is associated to an opportunity with a contact role. Finally, on this line, we've got the custom objects. And again, Pardot can read custom objects that are directly linked to any lead, contact, or account that are synced to Pardot. So again, custom objects are typically used to segment your audience based on any products or services that you offer. So good examples of custom objects might be things like order history, or they might be very specific to the line of business that you're in. Maybe tracking things that you've sold to customers or subscriptions that they have active. Again, all usable for segmentation within Pardot. And then we've got 3 other objects to mention in terms of sync, which are campaigns, tasks, and users. So from a campaign perspective, campaigns represent marketing initiatives. So these could be things like webinars, email sends, or events that you're hosting. And campaigns allow you to track these important marketing interaction information, like the cost of the campaign, the date and time of the campaign, but also really importantly, who you're targeting with a campaign with functionality called campaign members. And whilst campaigns do sync into Pardot, the really useful scenario for using campaigns is this concept of campaign members. So campaign members allow us to actually understand who we have targeted and influenced with our marketing campaigns. What you'll see in the next few sessions when we're talking about, you've got some other trainers coming in to talk about things like forms and landing pages and emails. You'll see a feature called completion actions in Pardot. And completion actions actually allow you to update campaign member statuses for leads and contacts in Salesforce based on the interaction with your marketing campaigns. So that's a really crucial element of that sync between Pardot and Sales Cloud. The next one is tasks. So they also sync, and they sync actually from Pardot to Salesforce. So I'm sure most of you have a Salesforce admin background, so you'll know tasks, but if you don't, a task just represents a to-do list in Salesforce. And Pardot can create these tasks that are associated to leads or contacts directly in Salesforce when these prospects fulfill certain criteria. So let's imagine somebody might complete a form. They might submit a form on our website, and we might want to create a task in Salesforce for a salesperson to follow up on that form submission. So Pardot can create the task directly in Salesforce and choose who to assign it to. The last thing to sync is user records. So Pardot can actually sync user records from Salesforce, and this is really useful to help streamline user management in Pardot. So it's quite a new feature in Pardot called user sync, but rather than manually creating all of your users for Pardot, you can actually just say to Pardot to pull in any users with a certain profile. Let's say if you've got users who have a marketing profile in Salesforce, you can say that any user with this marketing profile would be created as a Pardot user with a certain permission level in Pardot. It's definitely part of the administration topic, but it's not part of the specialist exam. So from the perspective of this exam, you just need to know that users sync, but you don't need to know the full setup in terms of those profiles and how it all behaves. Just moving along as well, the final piece of the puzzle is something that I mentioned before, which is called the connector user. So this connector user is just a Salesforce user whose permissions control Pardot's access to your Salesforce org. And there's actually two different types of connector user with Pardot, and it depends on if you have a version 1 connector or a version 2 connector, as I mentioned a couple of slides before. So if you purchase Pardot, or any of your customers purchase Pardot after February last year, then you have something called a version 2 connector in your account, which actually gives you access to an automatically provisioned connector user, which is called the Pardot integration user. Any accounts that were purchased before February last year actually use any Salesforce user for that connector. So you would need to create a Salesforce user specifically for Pardot to use. And of course, because Salesforce users incur a license cost, you were actually paying in the past to have a user just for Pardot to sync between the two platforms. So the great thing is that because of this version 2 connector and the integration user, that's actually a free user in Salesforce. So it's actually reducing license costs. But the other benefit of that integration user is that it actually comes out of the box with all the permissions needed and giving Pardot full visibility to see everything that it needs to see out of the box in Salesforce. So there was a benefit in terms of ease of setting up, but also a benefit in terms of license cost. The important thing to bear in mind with this connector user, and there may be questions on this in the exam, is that Pardot can only sync any records in Salesforce that this connector user can see. So let's say, for example, if your business is selling in 2 different countries and your connector user only has access to read records in Salesforce that belong to country A, then Pardot can't actually sync any records in Salesforce that belong to country B. So you just need to be very careful in terms of things like sharing rules for your connector, just to make sure that your connector user and therefore Pardot can actually see all the records that it needs to. So definitely, if there is any questions in the exam around Pardot not being able to see certain records in Salesforce, it's generally related to one of a few things, which might be that the connector user is not correctly initialized, or it's not correctly running, which we'll look at in a second, or it could be related to the fact that the connector user is actually syncing correctly and is verified, but it just doesn't have access to view the right records. So we'll have a look at all that in a minute. The next point before we look inside Salesforce and Pardot is just to understand what actually happens between the two systems when they sync. So as we can see at the bottom here, records sync between Pardot and Salesforce every 2 to 4 minutes. And Pardot does process those records that it needs to sync in something called batches. So it will try to process updates to 400 records at a time, and then bring any updates from Salesforce into Pardot, and then also update any records in Salesforce that need updating. But Pardot doesn't try to sync all of our database every 2 to 4 minutes. It's only going to try and update any records that have updated since the last update. And there's 3 different ways which Pardot actually uses to see if a record has been updated and needs to sync. And we can classify these as prospect activities, user activities, or system activities. So in terms of prospect activities, and I won't go through all these in a huge amount of detail because it's not specifically required for the exam, but it's good to understand the concept of sync triggering. Any of these items in the list, generally prospect interaction with marketing assets, will actually cause a sync to trigger in Salesforce. So for example, if the prospect submits a form, they will be queued to sync again with Salesforce. In terms of user activities, these are things that marketing users do inside Pardot. So this could be, for example, importing records into your Pardot database. That would queue for sync any records that have been updated as part of that import, who are assigned to a salesperson, of course. Or for example, updating field values on the prospect record. So there's a few other scenarios which cause updates, changing the assigned user, for example, updating the campaign, or manually clicking the sync button, which we'll be looking at later. And then finally, the last thing that causes an update is something called system activities. So these are generally automations in Pardot, such as updating records, maybe by automations like automation rules, for example. And then also adding prospects to Salesforce campaigns. So if we inside Pardot add a prospect to a Salesforce campaign with a particular member status, maybe that's because they've submitted a form, then that's going to again trigger the sync for that record between Pardot and Salesforce. And yeah, also updating the campaign member status as well as updating the membership of a campaign. They'll both update and queue the record for sync. So I just wanted to jump inside Pardot and actually look at some of those settings. So if we navigate into Pardot here, you find all of your account settings under the Pardot settings tab in the Pardot Lightning app. Once we click on this settings option, the first thing we see are our top level account settings. So from an administration perspective, one thing that does quite often come up on the exam is understanding our notification settings. So if we just click edit in here, we can actually scroll down and change any of this information about our Pardot account. including some of the more advanced functionality, but this definitely won't be on the exam. But importantly, we can change our notification settings. So if we click on here, we can change the user in Pardot who will receive any notifications about any of these important topics. So for example, renewal notices, any email compliance issues, if you have a high bounce rate, for example, critical incidents, etc. So we can choose the right users in Pardot to receive any of these communications, and we can click on Save Account, and that will update our settings. The final one just to look at in here is usage and limits. And in this tab, we can see how our Pardot account stacks up against the usage limits that we have. So we can see, for example, how many prospects we have in our mailable database. This is a really important thing to keep an eye on. And definitely from an administration perspective, it's a really important topic just to keep on top of the fact that you do have your Pardot subscription is defined by the number of mailable prospects in your Pardot database. So a mailable prospect, as you might have covered yesterday, is somebody who is in your Pardot database as a prospect and is eligible to receive emails. So that means that they have not opted out of communications, and it means that they've not hard bounced or had 5 soft bounces, which sets the do not email flag. So essentially, as an admin, you want to keep on track just to make sure that you're not going over any of these usage limits. Looking more specifically in terms of this Salesforce connector, we can navigate down to the connectors tab within the Pardot settings. And we can see in here our salesforce.com connector. Next to the username, you can see the username of the connector user in Salesforce. And we can see that this is a B2B MA integration user, which means it's one of the Pardot connector version 2 users that are automatically created for you and linked to Pardot as part of your Pardot subscription. And when your account's provisioned, that is automatically set up for you. One of the common exam questions might be around troubleshooting when you've got sync issues. So one of the things to look at here is just to check the status of this connector. So we can see that this connector has a tick status, which means that it's connected between Pardot and Salesforce correctly. But if you had a cross to say that there's an issue here, you can actually click this Actions button. And just where we have here pause sync, you would be able to click that and decide to resume the sync if your connector is not syncing correctly. Let's have a look at some of these connector options. It's just taking a bit of time to load here. So what we might see on the exam is just a question around this connector user. So we do have, even though this is a version 2 account and we have this B2B MA integration user which has been automatically connected, we do have the option to change the connector user between Pardot and Salesforce. So we could decide to use our own user in Salesforce for that integration that we could then create in Salesforce, give that user the permissions that we want. So for example, defining the object settings, maybe we want to change which fields the Pardot has access to. Maybe we want to change which records the Pardot connector user has access to. So we could change the connector user to a different user that we create if we wanted. But generally, it's recommended to use the out-of-the-box integration user, just because it already has all of the permissions needed for the majority of Pardot instances out of the box. You also have some options below to customize the settings for that connector. And again, a lot of these are out of the scope of the exam, but just to quickly touch upon a few, which are the more relevant ones. The first option we have is if we want to automatically create prospects in Pardot, if they are created as a lead or contact in Salesforce. We talked earlier about the fact that when a prospect record is created in Pardot, they do not get synced into Salesforce unless we assign them to a user or to a queue. But on the other side, we also might want any new records that are created in Salesforce. For example, if a salesperson creates a lead manually, we might want that new lead to also sync into Pardot so that it can become part of our marketing campaigns. So if we check this box, any new leads or contacts in Salesforce will be created as prospects in Pardot once they are created in Salesforce. And when we have this ticked, we can choose a campaign to associate those prospects to. So I'm sure yesterday campaigns were covered as a concept, but just to touch upon this in a very summarized version, the campaign in Pardot represents the first touch points that a prospect has had with your marketing initiatives. And it's really a measurement of the first time that the Pardot database has seen a particular record and where they came from. So in this sense, if a record was automatically created in Pardot because it was created in Salesforce, then it's recommended to just select a campaign, and you might need to create this in the campaigns tab first, but you would create a campaign for Salesforce integration. Some people call it Salesforce campaign, some people call it Salesforce integration campaign, and this just tells you that this particular record that has synced across has synced into Pardot because it was created in Salesforce. And then just looking down the list, there's a few other options in terms of the syncing between the two systems. So we've got this option here. If records do not have a CRM ID to match when syncing, use the email address to match. This is generally a recommended option. This just ensures that any records that are synced to Salesforce will be able to actually match a existing lead or a contact based on email address if you don't already hold a CRM ID for them. Just looking at some of the other ones, a common question is around email logging. So we do have the option in here to sync Pardot emails with Salesforce. And just as I mentioned before with the connector options, we can actually create Salesforce tasks for any email sent from Pardot. So if I send an email out to 100 people in Pardot, I can create 100 different tasks associated to those recipients in Salesforce if I tick this box. Generally, and out of the box, this is not a recommended feature for most users, simply because if we sync all of our Pardot emails that are sent to Salesforce, then this actually uses up our Salesforce storage limits. Whereas there are actually ways, and this is more a product consultant exam question, so I won't go too much into this, but there are ways to actually view the emails that each person has received directly in Salesforce without using your Salesforce storage. So it's generally not recommended. And then you've got some options for email notifications as well at the bottom. So enabling Salesforce emails to be sent when Pardot creates tasks, enabling Salesforce emails to be sent when assignment rules are triggered in Salesforce, and then also sending Pardot notifications when a merge is synced down from Salesforce. So if a Salesforce, if let's say if two Salesforce leads are merged, the setting will determine if you get a Pardot notification once Pardot syncs that merge back down as well into its own database. Once you change the settings, you can click Save Connector. And then if we just go back, you would want to just ensure that the status of your connector remains connected. And again, with this version 2 connector, we can pause the sync at any time between Pardot and Salesforce by clicking the pause button, and we can resume it by clicking the play button. So the next topic to look at is custom fields and field mappings. And what we want to do generally with Pardot is to bring in as much information into the Pardot database as we will need for two main scenarios. So the first scenario we would need a field to be created in Pardot is when we would want to be able to capture this field as part of a form. So let's imagine we have a web form, and as part of our journey, we want prospects to come to this form, submit the details, and then, of course, down the line, they're going to be qualified and created in Salesforce. So we want to have a think as an organization, what kind of things do we want to capture on a Pardot form so that we're actually passing into Salesforce and therefore passing to salespeople leads with all of the right details that they need. So Pardot does include out of the box a lot of what it calls default fields, which are mapped between the two systems. And these default fields are generally things like address information, job titles, very generic information that is appropriate and relevant to a lot of different businesses. But of course, every business or organization wants to capture its own specific values into fields related to its own process. And this is where custom fields come in. So it's first of all to capture relevant data, but then it's also to actually allow us to segment our audience based on the criteria that we would use to send emails. So we might have a custom field, for example, if we are at an organization which splits its email sending across different territories of the world. So we might have a field called region, which is potentially not a default Salesforce field, but we want to create this field called region. We want to have values for EMEA, APAC, and Americas. And we want to be able to actually build lists of prospects in Pardot, which are in these different regions. So we would need to create a custom field for this. So we got the steps on the right-hand side for your reference on how to do this. And in a second, I'll show you how to do this directly in Pardot as a demo. But really the main important things to do when we're creating a custom field is to decide if that custom field should be syncing with Salesforce. And if it does need to sync with Salesforce, we're going to then in here in the salesforce.com field name, select the field in Salesforce that we want this custom field to sync to. The next important piece is to define the sync behavior. So I've already talked about this in the context that we have the 3 different scenarios in how Salesforce and Pardot can sync together. So is Salesforce the master for this field? Is Pardot the master for this field? Or should the most recently updated database actually overwrite the other? So we would select that. And then the final important piece of this is to select the field type. And if we do choose a field type which allows multiple values, we're going to get an option below to actually define what those multiple values would be. So for example, if we are syncing to a Salesforce field, which is a pick list in Salesforce, then we can define what those pick list values are and check that Pardot is pulling the right values across. And I've got a reference table here for you, which explains how we would map typical fields between Pardot and Salesforce. So again, I'm going to leave this for reference, but just wanted to touch upon a couple of points in more detail. The first thing to note here is that in terms of Pardot field types, they don't always match Salesforce field types. So for example, there's nothing called a pick list in Pardot. So of course, in Salesforce, we have the field type for pick list, but that just doesn't exist in Pardot. And also, there might be a mismatch between the types of fields as well. So for example, a checkbox in a checkbox in Pardot is not a checkbox in Salesforce, for example. So I've also included formats. So again, you can read this in your own time, just to explain what each of these types of fields are and how to use them. Just definitely a topic which often comes up on the exam. I'm going to leave my cursor steady so that the bar along the bottom disappears. But this, if you look at the bottom row, we can see that On the right-hand side for Salesforce field type, we have lookup or formula. And these are actually field types that we should not sync to Pardot. Certainly in terms of a lookup field, it's not possible to sync it to Pardot. In terms of a formula field, we can actually set up a sync to Pardot, but it's highly not recommended. That's because, of course, in terms of formula fields in Salesforce, the formula field actually stores a calculation, not a value. So if that value updates in Salesforce, that does not trigger a sync with Pardot. So it's very common if you do sync formula fields into Pardot for the values to be out of date. So it's just not recommended. But you'll get the slides to just double check over the rest of the field types, what this means, and how to sync it in Salesforce. So I think that's a useful resource. So let's have a look now into Pardot in terms of how to map those custom fields. So this time we navigate again to Pardot settings. We go to object and field configuration, and we're going to map prospect fields. So these are the fields which would map to a lead or a contact in Salesforce. If we wanted to add a new custom field to map between the two systems, we can click that Add Custom Field button, which was in the top right, and we can give our field a name, and we can also select which Salesforce field it aligns to. So what I would commonly do is I would click on the salesforce.com field names, and I will find the field that I would like to sync with. So let's say, for example, the level field. So once I click this, what we see is that Pardot's very smart, and by default, it would try to keep any values associated to this field in Salesforce in sync directly in Pardot, because what we don't want is for us to capture a value called, let's say, third or first, let's say, in a Pardot form, but then we try to sync that into Salesforce, and the Salesforce value is actually primary. So Salesforce rejects that value, or we get values that are not consistent across the two systems. So by keeping this checkbox ticked, we're making sure that the values that we capture in Pardot are very much aligned with what we store in Salesforce. Below this, we can choose that master database. So again, we can choose, does Salesforce win if the values are different when they sync? Does Pardot win? Or does the most recently updated record win? You can select the field type, but in this case, it's been automatically detected from Salesforce as a drop-down field because that is a pick list in Salesforce. So we can leave that, and that's fine. We might also want to consider adding a name in here. So let's say level. I'm just going to keep the same naming as we have in Salesforce. And at the bottom, we've got a couple of extra options called record and display multiple responses. So what this means is that it would actually append the selection for, if somebody submits a form or with this field filled in, it would append the selection onto the field. So they would have maybe tertiary and secondary as the field value. So we want to be very careful, of course, when we're syncing with Salesforce fields that only allow the one value to be selected. And importantly, we can also set something called a default mail merge value. And I mentioned that one of the common use cases for fields to be synced between Pardot and Salesforce is for personalization. So what we can do, just like you might have seen in emails where you can insert a hi first name or dear first name, what we need to consider is that if somebody does not have a value for that field, there's a risk that they would be seeing something like hi blank or dear blank. We can actually set this default mail merge value to populate a standard value if somebody is missing this particular field being populated. So it's not so relevant in this case, but if you imagine going back to the first name field, we could enter something like customer. So it would say dear customer instead of dear blank. Once you've edited your settings, you can create custom field by clicking there. In fact, just one thing to show you very quickly, if I just do a quick test, is that once I do click on create field, you get this very useful pop-up asking you to queue prospects for a full sync. And this relates to the fact that when we create a new field in Pardot, this does not automatically pull down any values that exist for that field in Salesforce. So we're essentially creating an empty container when we create a new custom field. But what we need to do is tell Pardot to do a full resync of its database back to Salesforce to pull in the value for that new field from all of our records in Salesforce. So we need to click the sync prospect button to queue up all of our records for a full sync once we add in a new custom field. We can also edit custom fields and delete them just using the actions bar. The logic is exactly the same when we go back to the default fields. So you can do all of that configuration. It's just that these default fields are pre-configured for you out of the box, but you can choose which Salesforce fields that they sync to if you want to change that. The last one to look at in here is something called custom objects. This is definitely an exam topic. And as mentioned earlier, Pardot can have visibility of custom objects in Salesforce for segmentation purposes. So I've included a few notes from an exam perspective on the right-hand side here, but this functionality to sync with custom objects is a higher tier functionality of Pardot. So it's only available for Pardot Advanced customers, or Pardot Plus customers can pay to add it on. Custom objects are read-only in Pardot, so you can't update custom object records from Pardot. And equally, you can't personalize emails or landing pages with information from custom objects. They are purely for segmentation and building lists. You can't actually say, bring in values from the custom object to populate an email. In terms of the sync, they don't sync as often as prospect records. So custom objects sync around every 10 minutes. And then any new custom object records and updates to existing custom objects do sync automatically after that object is created in created in Pardot. And you do need to manually sync any custom objects that were created in Salesforce before the Pardot Connect user was created. So just a quick look at custom objects. So if I go in here, here's a custom object menu. So we can choose to add a new custom object. So I can choose which object in Salesforce to map to. In this case, maybe we want to map to the case object. Let's imagine I want to send out Pardot emails to anybody who has a case which has closed successfully, let's say, to ask them for a, I don't know, customer survey. So we click the CRM object to sync with. We can select the display name, the plural name, and the display field. So the display field actually defines, when we look at a prospect record, the view of all the cases that are associated to them. So you would see the case number against each case in that view. If we click create custom object, we can see here that the case custom object has been created, and we can actually choose the custom fields to map across. So by default, only the kind of ID number for this object has been synced, but we can, not synced, displayed in tables in Pardot, but we can choose which are the most important fields to display in tables. So let's say I want to have a look at escalated, closed, and who the owner is. So I can select that. And then if I come back, then any cases that are associated to a prospect, for example, will show those fields. So just coming back to the slides, we've done the demo. And the next thing to talk about is Salesforce sync errors. So this is a key part of the exam. And I just want to explain kind of the scenarios for sync errors. So most errors in Pardot for the connector actually occur when a prospect fails to sync correctly with Salesforce. So what you need to know for the exam is how to check for sync errors in Pardot. So the great news is that there is actually a sync errors menu in Pardot, which makes it very simple for you to see which records have had an error when they are syncing. So you just follow these instructions. It's under Pardot settings, and in that connectors menu again, you would find that salesforce.com connector. You click the actions cog and then select the sync errors option. We'll look at that in a second. And just looking at common types of errors, these are the 4 main types of errors that you'll see. So just explaining why they happen. Typically, a sync error happens when Pardot tries to save an update to a field in Salesforce, but Salesforce does not accept that value. A common one is where you have validation rules in Salesforce, or things like enforced pick list values, just like we looked at with the field before, where you had 3 different options in the Salesforce field, but if Salesforce is set up to reject any values that don't match those defined pick list values, then you would get an error. So there's also something that we could categorize as access issues. So as I was saying, because Pardot accesses Salesforce with the connect user, there can be all kinds of permission issues that prevent Pardot from updating a record or updating a specific field. Maybe the Pardot connector does not have edit access for the job title field, let's say. So when Pardot tries to update the job title field, Salesforce throws an error. There's also process issues. So this is commonly seen when you have mandatory fields, dependent fields in Salesforce, and maybe Pardot tries to save a record and you're missing a mandatory field, or you've got dependent fields that don't align to the values that you're passing over. And finally, just something that we could categorize as customization issues. This is just because of the customizable nature of the Salesforce platform. Each user generally does see some of their own errors that don't fall into these categories. And what you should be looking at in this case is that sync error description, which we'll have a look at now. And that usually does point you in the right direction of why this error is happening. Maybe if a particular field value is set, then that would cause a trigger or a flow to fail, for example. There's also a kind of step-by-step guide to how to resolve sync errors. So we'll have a look at this now, and we'll run into a demo on how to do it. So first of all, you would review the error details. You would then identify why the error is happening. You would resolve the issue, and that could be a resolution in Pardot or in Salesforce, and then you would trigger the sync. So I've created an example error in the connector in this test org. So if I go into the connectors menu, I click on the actions, what you can see here is that we have 1 sync error in the queue. So if I click on this sync error, what we can see is we can see the name of the prospect who we've had an error for. I've just used my name on the test record. We can see when did the error happen, and we can see what was the error. So this is where we need to become a bit of a Pardot detective. So we can open this record, and the error said it was invalid, that the region for this record would be set as UK. So if I click into this region field, and this is a custom field for region, I'm going to just edit this field. And I can see that this is a text field type in Pardot. So what we can see is that Salesforce is rejecting that value of UK. So I'm going to go back to my prospect, and I'm going to look at this record in CRM. I'm going to go into the details section, and I can see my region field here. So I'm just going to check what the values are here. So we can see that the region field is set up to only accept America, APAC, or EMEA. And we could, of course, go back into the settings in Salesforce as an admin and just double check the validation that we've got set around this field. But it's quite safe to say that this is a pick list and we've got 3 values that are acceptable. So what I would do in this case is it tells me that my field is incorrectly set up in Pardot. I'm going to go back into this custom field setting, and for this region field, I'm going to change the field type. But first of all, we've got this option above, and it's, as I mentioned before, keeping the field type and values in sync with the CRM. And this is a really good first point to try if you're having sync errors. Once I click this, we can see that the field type has changed from text to drop down, and that Pardot has automatically pulled in Americas, APAC, and EMEA as the possible values. So I'm going to go ahead and save that custom field. And I can then go back to my prospect record. Just click back a couple of times. I'm going to edit that record, and then I can navigate to my custom fields, and strangely enough, the region is not showing there. Just bear with me, it's being a bit laggy. Just going to click back in. That may not have saved correctly. Yes, I see what's happened here. So what we also have to do when we choose this option to keep the fields type and values in sync with the CRM is that we need to also just make sure that the checkboxes here are enabled, or you fall into the rookie error that I just made, and you tick those just to make sure that these are the values available. So we're going to go back to my prospect record here, and this time this will work. As I scroll down, select custom fields, and now we see the options. So we still see UK just because this prospect has an option of a value of UK, but I'm going to select EMEA, and then now what you'll see is that it still says that the prospect has a sync error, and this is an important consideration for the exam. What you need to do is, after the sync error has been fixed, we need to make sure that we trigger this record to sync. So there's 2 ways that we can do this. We can manually click the CRM sync button at the top right, or we can go back into our sync error queue. I'm going to go back to connectors. Go back to sync errors, and let's imagine if we have 500 different records with sync errors, we're not going to want to click in one by one and then click the sync with CRM button. What we're going to do is, in fact, make sure that we've got all of the records selected, and then we're going to use the CSV export option. We're going to export a full list of all those prospects with sync errors, and then we're going to import them back into Salesforce, into Pardot, and add those records again. And that's action of importing actually makes sure that Pardot then triggers the sync for all those records. In this scenario, I'm just going to click the sync with CRM button, and we can see, fantastic, the prospect synchronized successfully. And back in Salesforce, we're going to see that the value of the region field has updated. So we've successfully followed those steps here. We've reviewed the error details, we've identified the cause, we've resolved the issue, and we've triggered a sync. And certainly there might be a question on the exam about how do you review the error details, and also about how do you then trigger a sync, or it might just ask you why the prospect is not syncing after you've fix the error. In that case, you just need to say that, yes, you need to trigger the sync, and there are 2 ways to do it. So just before the Q&A, I want to just cover the last topic, which is recycle bin. And if we just, I'm just going to close a couple of these extra windows. So the final topic of recycle bin is a really important concept in Pardot. And the recycle bin allows us to keep our accounts clean and tidy, whilst also making sure that we can restore things if we ever make any mistakes. So if I just navigate into the Pardot settings, just to show you the recycle bin, what we can see in here is that admins have access to this recycle bin, and each of the modules in Pardot, well, almost each of them, there's no recycle bin for files, has the option to see what are the deleted items. So we can navigate into, for example, email template draft. We can then click on some of the items or assets in our recycle bin, and then click the undelete option, and then click go. And this will actually restore anything out of the recycle bin into our Pardot account. And this is really important because if you imagine using Pardot for a few different years, it's going to be very common that you have a lot of different assets built up that you're no longer using anymore. Maybe you need to do a Pardot account spring clean every year, for example. So what we can do is we can navigate into a particular module, for example, emails. I can look at my published email templates. I can select maybe a test email that I don't need anymore. And then I can click the delete option and then click go. That will then clean this record out of my Pardot email templates and put it into the recycle bin. The great thing is we can just restore it very easily, just like I showed you. So you can always get back to it. The important thing is that we can also delete prospects. So this record that I've just started to sync, I can actually just delete them if I would like. So if I click on delete here, then we see one prospect is queued to be deleted, and they will go into the recycle bin. So I go back into my settings, and I go to the recycle bin. We'll see in here, as I scroll down, we've got one prospect in the recycle bin. I can then, if I choose in future, have 2 options against a prospect. So I can permanently delete them, or I can undelete them. If I want them to go back into my prospects tab and become eligible to receive emails again, I can click on undelete. However, I do have the option to permanently delete, and this is a newer setting that has been a result of GDPR. So of course, as I'm sure you probably know, one of the requirements for GDPR is that people in your database should have the right to be forgotten, as in permanently deleting their data. So we can actually permanently delete prospect data by clicking the permanently delete option and pressing go. Just one thing to mention about recycle bin is that it's actually a very useful piece of functionality to keep you within your database limits. Just as I showed you at the start of the call, going back into the usage and limits tab, we can see in here our usage for various things like our prospects, our landing pages, and our forms. What we might decide is if we are coming up to our limit of 50 forms, maybe that is a really great time to do our spring clean, delete those forms, they go into the recycle bin, and they no longer count towards our usage limit. And the exact same applies for our Mailable database. So if we send our prospects to the recycle bin by deleting them, they no longer count towards our limits. So certainly one thing you might want to consider is maybe a time-based delete of prospects after they no longer interact with your marketing initiatives, maybe for 6 months or for a year. So what that does is it makes sure that your database that you're sending to is clean and fresh, and it also ensures that you are keeping below your mailable database limit. Good. Okay, so that's the content covered. Shall we open up for Q&A? Let me see if we can get a list of the questions that have been answered. I don't know, Esha or Prashant, if you have access to that.
Yeah, sure, Matt. So I have actually, figured out a few of the questions. So
Great.
the first question is there a lead or contact have same ID? Means, are you mentioning the email ID?
Great question. So if we just go back into Pardot, the easiest way to illustrate this is to look at the record, which let's have a look at one of the records in here. So you're absolutely right that lead ID and contact ID are different. However, what we can see is if we navigate to a prospect record and scroll down, we can see in here which CRM record type they are identified to be. So Pardot can see that this particular person is a contact, and you'll see above this CRM lead ID and CRM contact ID. So we can see here that it's identified the correct CRM contact ID and added it in here and marked it as a contact. And the brilliant thing with Pardot, and definitely a differentiator to Marketing Cloud, is that if we start that journey from somebody being a lead, they then convert, well, a salesperson may convert them to a contact, then automatically Pardot keeps the same prospect record, but updates from looking at that lead ID, which has now been converted, of course, and it updates this same record with the new contact ID and marks that it's a contact. And we can see all of the history in one place. So you're not kind of losing that connection once somebody converts to a lead or from a lead to a contact. It's always that CRM ID, which is the primary identifier for any record syncing with Salesforce. I hope that answers.
Yes, it does. So I think I'll move on to the next one. What stage of the process a CRM ID is created in Pardot?
Good question. So the stage of the process that they are created is at that point where we are assigning somebody to sales. So it's at that point that we actually assign a prospect record to a salesperson or to a queue, which is when the logic that we looked at in the slides, it's probably easiest just to quickly flick back to this. If I just find that one. It's at this stage. So what happens is it's once they are assigned to a user and the new lead is created in Salesforce, that's when Pardot tells Salesforce to create the lead with the details that it passes over, and then Pardot receives from Salesforce the lead ID of the newly created lead.
Okay. And the next question is related to this only. So the question is, for some case, I don't assign users. Suppose I want to push to CRM. Is there any way to push?
So this is definitely a common question, but if we just go back into Pardot and I look at assignment, so I don't actually have a queue set up. So the common scenario where you don't want to assign to a specific user is when you would actually want to use a queue. So you would be assigning to a queue of users, and then anybody in that queue would be able to pick that lead out and then work on the lead. What I have seen at other organizations, when they don't want to even use a queue or they've not maybe got the technical capability to do so, is that they might actually just create a new user in Pardot, which is something like Salesforce admin user, and they would then sync any records to that new user. So maybe something like if I add a new user and you don't want it to be a specific person. So I've seen this quite a few times. Let's call it SF admin. And by the way, this isn't necessarily best practice. It's just how some organizations set this up. They would then link this to maybe an admin user in Salesforce, not a salesperson, maybe just an integration user, and then assign the leads to that user, and then they can then be picked up down the line when they are ready to be sales ready. But definitely one of the main concepts around Pardot and how you will use Pardot is for you to, as a consultant, understand what stage is a lead ready to be picked up by sales. So typically, the normal process is for you to be assigning the record into Salesforce at the point that the record is ready to be picked up by sales. So yeah, there are ways around it, but it's definitely worth having a really strong think about your sales and marketing handover process. Next question.
Yeah. So the next question is something related to GDPR. So the question is, how are we going to address the GDPR and other data privacy regulations in syncing data between systems if the implementation is across multiple countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. So definitely this is something that is not a key factor on the specialist certification. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the general best practice from a Pardot perspective, when we're talking about GDPR, in addition to that capability for right to be forgotten in the recycle bin that we just looked at, is to actually make usage of Pardot's preferences page. So again, not part of this exam, but what we can do in Pardot, and let's see the standard one. We don't have any lists in there, but the best practice is to be using Pardot's email preferences page, which allows users to select which communications they would like to opt into. So it's a really important aspect of what we would call permission-based marketing. So we certainly don't want to be buying lists, importing them into Pardot, and then just sending emails to the list. We want to make sure that we're targeting people who have opted into our communications. So that's something to consider first of all when we create our web forms to try and generate new records in our database. When you're creating your web forms, consider if from a GDPR perspective, you need to have maybe an opt-in checkbox. And then once they have opted in, that's when you're sending them emails. You're giving them access to this email preferences page to opt in and out of communications when they want to. So you're getting the permission to market to them, but you're also giving them the capabilities to stop receiving communications when they no longer want to hear from you.
All right. So I'll just move on to the next one. So this is something related to the knowledge, the person wants to have regarding these connectors which are there. So do we have to have deep knowledge about all the connectors for this particular exam?
Good question. So if we go back, I just want to be very specific here in terms of what the exam guide tells us. So the exam guide tells us that we don't need to be able to configure the package. We don't need to be able to do Salesforce configuration of Pardot, but what we do need to do is troubleshoot and solve basic platform issues, including sync errors, field mapping, and supported objects. So that's what we've covered today in the training. You'll notice that I've not gone into a great deal about the configuration and setup of the connector itself. I've given a very brief overview for a context perspective, but that's not part of the exam anyway. So definitely a deeper understanding of the connector would be very valuable for the Pardot consultant certification, which is the higher level certification after this. But for this, it's about troubleshooting errors.
Okay, moving on to the next one. Is the sync between Pardot and Salesforce retroactive?
So I think I understand the question here. So it's a good question. And just to explain for everybody, what they're asking here is, if I set up the connector to start syncing today, will that connector sync with all existing previously created records in Salesforce? So the answer is no. The connector is actually only forward-looking out of the box, and that's why one of the things we just looked at was how to tell Pardot to look at new records that are created. So if we just very quickly recap on that. So in here, we have this option. For automatically create prospects in Pardot if they are created as a lead or contact in Salesforce. So that tells Pardot to sync any new future created records, but yes, it's not retroactive. So what we need to do as part of implementation, and again, it's not necessarily tested for this exam, is you would need to export from Salesforce the email addresses and CRM IDs of any leads and contacts who you would like to exist in Pardot and sync between Pardot and Salesforce who already exist in Salesforce. So you would do that export, typically using a Salesforce report. You would import those records into Pardot, and then they would start to sync. So yeah, that's a really good question.
Okay. We have got many questions regarding the business unit part, and I think a business unit is not a part of this particular specialist exam, if I'm not wrong.
You're exactly correct. So business units are not part of this exam.
Okay, so I'll be just skipping out on the business unit questions, and I'll be moving on to one of the interesting question which came up is there a concept of auto delete of assets after a certain duration, like 15 days from a data of delete from recycle bin permanently?
Okay, so it's a good question. There's not an auto delete from recycle bin after a certain time period. The closest you might get to that is that in an asset in Pardot, what we do have is something called an archive date. So if I just edit a particular email template, if I go to the basic info, it's probably only on forms. Just bear with me. So in a form, let's try a landing page actually, just bear with me. Yeah, so in some assets in Pardot, you will have this archive date. That's the closest that you get to what you're asking for. And what we can say in here is that, let's say after August the 5th, this landing page will no longer appear in my list of landing pages. So it keeps the view very clean from a user perspective. They just go into the archived landing pages section. But they don't actually go into the landing page recycle bin, and they don't get deleted. And there's no kind of time-based rules in the recycle bin logic either. But that's a very good best practice functionality to use.
All right. So there is one more question regarding the recycle bin. Is there anything which does not go to the recycle bin after deleting?
Yeah, so the standout item that does not go to the recycle bin when deleting is actually files. So definitely one of the common questions or common issues that I see when we talked about usage limits earlier in the Pardot settings option is that you do have a file storage limit in Pardot. And so it's very common that users need to delete files. So what we see is that when a file is deleted, this actually does not go into the recycle bin, and it is immediately deleted and non-recoverable. So that's definitely the one that trips up a lot of users.
Okay, and moving on to the last question. The question is like SFMC, can we use the Pardot to send emails to its from customers and also send emails from Salesforce Service and Sales Cloud?
I don't actually understand the question. Could it be rephrased, perhaps? Send emails from customers?
Yeah, it's can we use Pardot to send emails to its customers and also send emails from Salesforce Service Cloud? If I'm not wrong, the person wants to say the emails which are being sent out from Pardot, can they be sent out from Salesforce as well? The Sales Cloud part, because I think this is something related to Salesforce Engage. If I'm not wrong, we can have those Pardot emails being moved on to the Sales Cloud and do it.
Yeah, so definitely Engage is a really important part of the toolkit for a marketer. It's definitely not part of the administration topic, and we are running out of time, but there is this functionality called Engage, definitely worth looking up. So you can Google this one, Salesforce Engage. That allows salespeople to send Pardot email templates, and you can define which email templates these are. You let your sales team send certain templates at certain touch points in the journey. So they would have access to the tracking capabilities and the Pardot templates that you build, and the flexibility to customize the emails however much or little that you give the sales team. So that's available in Sales Cloud.
All right. So I think this was the very last question. And okay, so there is something related to, do we need SAP for email sending from Pardot? So I think this is something related
Sender
to
authentication package.
Yes, correct. So this is something, the email sending, the authentication which we usually do. But I think both the processes are different. The SAP is you need to fill out a form in Marketing Cloud, and the sales support team takes over.
Sure.
And,
so it works. Yeah, I'm just doing a Marketing Cloud implementation at the moment. So yeah, it's definitely a different concept in Pardot. Let's make this the last thing to cover. Again, it's not actually part of the exam criteria. So yes, you do need to set up email authentication in Pardot. This is done in domain management on the left hand side, and we can set up our email sending domains and also tracker domains. So in here you would create your domain. It's a lot easier than Marketing Cloud. You create your domain, you set your SPF, Pardot gives you the domain key, and then you would work with your IT team to actually add those values into your domain setup. And just the same for tracker domains, which is the pages for hosting your Pardot landing pages, your Pardot files, your Pardot forms, etc. Again, the actual setup of this is not part of the exam curriculum, but useful to know.
All right. So I think we have covered like all the questions. So thank you, Matt. I think we are done with all the queries.
Thanks again, Matt, for your valuable time and for your expertise over admin part in Pardot Specialist exam. See you guys tomorrow. Tomorrow we have a featured session by Prashant. Prashant, do you want to give a glance about your session?
All right. So my session is a little bit apart from PPT. I'm just, moving on to a little bit. I'll show a small demo. I'll take a use case and try to show how actually, we can have the data flow into Pardot from a landing page, and then we can move into a nurturing campaign. Though I'll not be going in a lot in detail on the nurturing campaigns and the forms and form handler, but yes, I'll be just giving an overview of that part, and then we can have the question and answer session.
Okay, so we love demos, right? And the same we had today and more we'll have tomorrow. Thank you guys. Thanks for joining. The session is tomorrow, same time, 7:30 p.m. IST. So these sessions would be continued till Sunday, 7:30 p.m. That is 28th June. Stay tuned for more awesome content coming up. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.